Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Welcome back, everybody. We are here today. And by the way, we're doing this on Friday. So happy weekend, just about to start momentarily. And before we do that, let's try and make your life a little bit better. Let's give you the tools you need to move forward with your life. And he's got them. He is a life coach and he's fantastic. Dan Clark is back with us. How are you, Dan?
Oh my goodness, Steve. It's great to be back here and I am doing wonderful. It's the Midwest, still a little cold today, like 43, maybe going to be 55 today. Goodness gracious. We want spring to be here.
Yeah, we got same exact weather here. I got says 55 and sunny. It feels warm. Some of the flowers are blooming on this side. So it seems like we kind of get almost the same kind of weather.
What I find fascinating about the weather is everyone talks about it, but we have nothing to do with it, right? But it's a great place to start when you're thinking about the things that you like and you dislike. And it's sometimes something we just dislike.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, and this I'm digressing here, but you ever notice that it could be 45 degrees in the spring and it feels so much warmer than 45 degrees in the winter? And I haven't figured that out. I don't know if it's a mind thing, the angle of the sun. I don't know.
I don't either, but that's absolutely true.
Yeah, it's above my pay grade. Things you like and things you don't like. Where do we start today in terms of helping people move forward on their path?
Oh my gosh. I was thinking earlier today as I was kind of preparing for this time with you about why people show up in my world. And it's just all over the place because I'm a generalist. And for example, I worked with a guy that was an EMT. I was a director of a large program in a county, and his wife had left him over some anger issues. So he showed up in my world because of his anger. Well, it doesn't really matter sometimes why someone shows up in my world, because how we live life is based on the experiences that we had while we're growing up. So almost everyone goes through the same process of learning how to be aware of who they are. And so the issues that show up often are more complicated than they really need to be, because again, who doesn't want to be the best person that they can be? So those issues really aren't as important. But however, the things that show up the most is relationship issues, anxiety and depression, divorce. People have issues with either anger, or they didn't get the job that they wanted, or life is just not going well. And we always start with where they're at.
Let's recap for a sec. In that realm, I think you've said before that if you're dealing with anger issues, and I don't mean anger management, I mean, let's say being miffed at somebody, or, like you said, didn't get the job. I'm mad at myself. I'm just mad at that corporation, whatever it is. That anger transforms itself and manifests in other ways, like depression, sadness, whatever it might be. Do I have that right?
You have that absolutely right. Absolutely.
Interesting. So maybe.
Well, let's define anger. Anger is a unmet expectation.
An unmet expectation. Boy, you know what? We could just sit here in silence and start thinking of those times where you may have encountered, an anger situation and wonder if that's connected to the expectations.
Well, yeah, I wanted something and I didn't get it. Doesn't matter, it doesn't matter where my food isn't the right, or I can't find my shoes, or I'm late for work, or, there's the big expectations, and all of the frustration that we have in life, including anxiety, is built on me predicting things that I want to happen that don't happen.
Right. Yeah. Well, we've talked about that as well, worrying about things that you shouldn't even bother worrying about.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the interesting thing about life, though, and we've talked about this as we've been together for the last couple of weeks, is that life is built on the patterns that are established in how our brain functions while we're growing up. I mean, the things that we learn while we're growing up create the way that our brain functions. And one of the focuses that I've always had is educating someone about how their brain is functioning. And we've learned so much about the elasticity of a brain. For example, you can actually see chemically an emotion in your brain. You can see a thought, rather, going through the actual pattern in your brain. We can actually watch a thought in your brain move. What's fascinating is that you can think and choose to move that path. That's fascinating. And understanding that you have something that moves that chemical thing on the inside of you is the most powerful understanding about changing who we are, because you choose to change the way the thinking is actually happening.
That's powerful stuff. And it's funny you should say that, because I have a friend and a colleague that he's going I think it's a therapist that he's talking with, but he said to me, forget about all that other stuff. You need somebody that is going to focus on your brain, literally focus on your brain, which is what you're talking about, which is what you offer in terms of a life coach. And let me just tell you something. This guy I'm talking about, his name is Jim. It's completely changed his thought process. Completely.
Yeah, I find it amazing. I'm working with many individuals right now, but what I have discovered is that if I work with one person in the family, pretty soon I see about everyone in the family because they all see that transformation that happens. And
Right.
that's because as they begin to own and understand how they've come to the conclusions that they've come to and move away from them, it's really easy for them to begin to transform, but it's not an easy issue. And here's the interesting piece about this. Now, we're talking about weather, right? Like, I don't like rain. I don't like really cold weather, right? But we all have to live through that. But it's not about whether that we can live through it or not. It's about the fact that, are you willing, if you really want to become the person that you want to be, to practice being uncomfortable? And the level of your ability to be willing to be uncomfortable is the level with which you will transform. Those things are directly related. Here's one thing that I found that's also almost universal. Is there just one thing I can do just one time or a couple of times to really change who I am? Well, we're talking about the unconscious patterns that are below our thinking. And so you can't change your unconscious thinking with your conscious thinking. So that's why it takes time, about a 1 year, 2 years for it to be permanent, 1 year for your brain to kind of turn around, because you have to practice these skills that sometimes don't make sense, but they practically change, or they actually do change the way your brain actually uses the information inside you to rewire the unconscious brain.
So, Dan, when you're working with somebody, do you peel back the layers and get to the root of the problem? Let's say it's somebody that experienced something as a child, and that's where it all began.
Well, I never really go to that part of it because at some point it doesn't matter what happened to them.
Hmm.
And here's why, because it's how they're behaving today that all that matters, right? Well, if we figure out what happened, that's nice. And there may be some.
And it looks like we just lost Dan. I see a frozen screen. I know we're still on the air here. I don't know, Dan, can you hear me? You froze up on us. We're right like a pinnacle point. I was waiting to find out more. All right. So what we're going to do, if I don't hear Dan in a sec, we're going to take a short break and come back with Dan Clark, get reestablished in the connection. So hang tight. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Well, like we say, life just happens and some things just happen, like a power glitch.
That was amazing. I tell you what, that's kind of frustrating. But on my end, we had a power flip. And so we just went away.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Before that happened, we were talking about worrying about things that never happened. So we weren't even worrying about it. And here we are back. So it's all good. We're talking with life coach Dan Clark. You can find him at transformlife.net. And where did we leave off? We were talking about things that happen in your past, like in your childhood, and whether you identify those. And,
right.
And then your response to that was, well, it's good to have, but we don't always need to know. We need to know what's happening now.
That's correct. Actually, it's unimportant at some point to really figure out what happened, because all we need to know is that there's this pattern that's there, right?
Right.
And that pattern is always the result of the things that we've experienced. And sometimes we want to know. If you're looking for the why, however, what happens is we get stuck looking for the why, and it doesn't really fix anything. And I was headed down that path talking about, if we're not willing to be uncomfortable, then we're really not going to change. And the level of our willingness to be uncomfortable is how transformation really happens.
And if I heard you correctly, it's equatable to how long the transformation happens. So if you're right, is that it?
Yes. Well, again, we're talking about our unconscious thinking, and you cannot change your conscious thinking. You can't change your unconscious thinking with your conscious thinking. You can't think and transform your unconscious patterns. It's impossible. So that's why the only way to truly transform is to focus on doing behaviors that create this emotion that you don't want to feel as they show up, and you learn how to manage them. It's not complicated, but we can talk about that as we go forward. But really, it's about thinking, not just thinking. It's actually about doing. So behavior is the only way that we really change.
If we do have time today, I would love to get an example of that. Is there any way that you could illustrate that? Let's say,
Yes, I sure can. For example, we talked a minute ago about anger and how anger is an unmet expectation, right? Well, if you think about a bucket that is full of water and you pour more water in it, it's going to be messy, right? Well, when you have a lot of expectations and you always want things to go the way you want them to go, pretty soon that bucket of expectations is so full, you just like are over the top with your anger and your emotions, right? And so that empties the bucket a little bit. Well, in order to really change the process of what's inside that bucket, we have to practice something called just simply being uncomfortable. For example, when I worked with this young man I mentioned earlier that has a huge amount of anger, was an EMT guy, he had to practice being uncomfortable in his body by doing things that he didn't like to do. For example, and this is really simple, but it's also kind of silly. We practice standing close to someone, because learning how to be okay with your body when it's uncomfortable is what this is about, because your body doesn't know how to manage uncomfortability. Like it's silly, but the more that he practiced, that's one skill, standing close to people where he was uncomfortable. He wouldn't say anything to them, but just standing close. Like the other part of this would be also doing things like asking people for compliments or giving compliments, right? You're practicing doing things that you don't normally do. Or one person I worked with, they had to have 20 conversations with people they didn't know within 2 weeks. In a grocery store or wherever they met them, they had to say hello and talk with them, because learning how to do those very simple things actually transforms the brain. And here's why. Because your brain goes to the earliest memory to tell you how to behave today. We don't care what that memory is, but what we know is you don't have a skill today about being able to, I don't know, just be comfortable by talking to someone that you don't know. That's learned skills, right? And so in that respect, if you practice that skill, it teaches your body how to be okay with the energy that shows up when you're uncomfortable. And as that energy shows up, then you begin to understand, and your body begins to be used to, or it begins to understand that that body sensation isn't really scary. In the anger piece of that, and this is fascinating to me, that if you practice or pretend like you're angry enough, you'll actually teach your body what it's like to be angry. And then when the anger shows up, you can manage it a lot easier. Because as you're practicing anger, just like you're acting, if you're you pretend like you're angry. Like I had a plumber one time I was working with, and he was supposed to pretend to be angry for a while, and one of his coworkers said, "What in the hell are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm practicing being angry because my life coach told me to practice it," right? Because he couldn't say things to his wife that he wanted to say to her because it was so difficult, because he just held all of his anger, right? He was afraid to go over the top. Well, in the course of about 7 or 8 months after some of the things we did with him, they were having great conversations because he wasn't afraid to say what he was thinking, because he worked, first of all, with just being okay with how uncomfortable it was to start the conversations. That's why you have to start very lightweight and small for things to actually work. Remember, if we learn how to not say things to our parents or our siblings while we're growing up, we do the same pattern as adults. As a matter of fact, the rule is, what you can't say to a mom or a dad, you can't say to the person that you're married to or your intimate relationship. That's how powerful those patterns are when they show up in our world. So that's what we're working with, these patterns that are so buried on the inside of us.
wow, it really does make a lot of us think about our past, and
Yeah.
connecting the dots. What are you afraid of now? And how does that equate back to when you were a child?
Well, think about it from this perspective. If you can describe your mother and your father, then you can describe how your patterns were established.
Ha, okay, interesting. Makes
Yeah.
you think. Makes you think.
Yeah, because
Wow.
they're going to be similar to mom and dad, or whoever raised you.
Yeah. And I want to go back to the ENT gentleman that you worked with. And the first thing you told him was that he needed to stand close to somebody. And even though it's uncomfortable for him, do I have that right? Okay. Is that a universal exercise, or was that specific to him?
It's pretty universal, and that's because none of us like anyone to be super close. like when you're working with someone and they lean in and they're close to you, that's really okay because we have this natural pattern. But or someone that we're married to, or a spouse or a child or someone that we're close to, sometimes it's okay because we have this little distance. We all have that distance, right?
Sure.
But what he practiced here was in public, just getting close. Like if he was standing next to someone in a line, he would stand closer than he would normally stand, just to see what it felt like, right? You let them move away. You don't say anything to them, but what you want is for your body to experience the uncomfortableness of that. And as you feel that, your body becomes used to it. Think about it like hot bath or cold bath. When you know the water's hot, you're going to take your time to get used to it. And pretty soon it's not so hot. Well, that's why we practice that, because, and this is weird, but it's so true in our culture. We don't feel our emotions because we don't want to feel bad. And being uncomfortable is equated with feeling bad. And so what you're really practicing is allowing the body to have a sensation that you pushed away since you were small. And those sensations, as you begin to pay attention to them, allow you to be more aware of what's happening in your body so that you can choose what you want to do. And again, it's not complicated, but I want to go to the next stage of that. Now, there's yearnings. And we haven't talked about this a lot, but yearnings are so important. For example, when I don't feel important, I don't want to be around someone that makes me feel unimportant, right? If I don't feel anyone hears me or sees me, I don't want to be around someone who doesn't feel like they see me or hear me or understand me, right? Those are yearnings. When we have a yearning that's not being met, there's an emotion reaction to it, right? Like I'm not important. Right? That's anger or hurt. It's relationship issues, right? So understanding that a yearning is a core part of all of us and how that works is really important. The stage of developing yearnings or understanding them is how it happened while we're growing up. If a child doesn't feel seen or heard, doesn't feel important, doesn't feel known or understood, then it's hard for that child to feel loved and cared for because it's a slide. It starts at seen, heard, important, understood and known, loved and cared for. As you slide down, the bottom one is loved and cared for. If you don't get the other 5 or 4 above that, it's really hard to feel loved and cared for. As an adult, if you don't feel loved and cared for, you didn't get seen as a child, you didn't get heard as a child, you didn't feel important as a child, you didn't feel understood and known as a child. And so we equate, well, I know they love me, but we don't really experience it because the yearnings actually create feeling important or seen or heard, create the feeling of loved and cared for. That's why when you listen to someone, they feel loved. It's fascinating.
It is. And I love the slide analogy as you're coming down. It's almost like, remember the game Chutes and Ladders where you,
Oh my God.
right? What's the difference, or is there a difference between wants, needs, and yearnings?
Well, great idea. I mean, I love that question because it's really about how we are learning how to be aware of what I want and what I need and what's really happening inside me, right? Now, I want lots of things. I also feel like I need them, but there's a difference. If I need something, there's power in that. It's like I gotta have it, right? Like I just need them to pay attention to me or listen to me or to do the laundry the way I want them to do that, or my employee's just not doing they have to do it this way, right? When we have a high level need, it means that we're not really paying attention to the emotion that's creating that need, because we are really uncomfortable when it doesn't go our way. Now, this is a statement that you can pretty much bank on is true. What the brain doesn't get as a child, it will demand or need as an adult. So if you don't get seen, if you don't get heard, if you don't feel important, at some point, depending on your personality, one of those 4 will become very demanding in the way that you behave. We all know people that just want to feel important all the time, right? Now, sometimes we name that as arrogance or whatever, but really sometimes we just want to feel important because we didn't feel important as a child. Now, I'm going to equate this to need and want. We want to feel important, but we don't need it, right? We want to feel seen, but we don't need it. I mean, there's a difference between need and want. Need is a demand. want is something that we can live without, right? We can live without certain things. And we need air, we need water, we need food. We do need relationships at some point, but at some level, the demand for them creates the difficulties in all relationships. So we try to translate that into a want, because I can let go of a want, which is lightweight, a lot easier than I just have to. They just need to do this for me. And that's what creates most of the issues in a life. Like, for example, this EMT guy, he has need for feeling important, and his anger was things had to go his way so much, but because his need was he didn't get those yearnings met while he was growing up. And he translated that into this behavior of, you have to do it my way so I don't have this unpleasant feeling in my body.
Wow. This is huge for a lot of people, realizing it, that it's so important what you grew up with or did not grow up with, how it really kind of charts your journey in life.
Right. And so in that respect, it's about understanding what are the patterns that naturally show up in your world. What patterns are they? The patterns that show up, the things that you recognize that you consistently do, those are habits, but patterns are the things that we want to confront. But since we, habits and patterns aren't exactly the same thing. Like a pattern would be how you're always sarcastic when something's happening around you. That's a pattern. Sarcasm is anger that's hiding below the surface because things aren't going the way you want them to, right? Then there's the pattern of just always being happy, being fake. I just don't want anybody to know who I really am. Like, one of the biggest things that I work on with someone is the distance between who they think they are and who they want others to see them as. And the distance there is what we need to put together so that the people that what people see is the same person that they really are. And that's the distance between being real and present and alive and feeling life fully and pretending and hiding and having secrets.
Do you find a lot of people do that?
We all do it at some point, because as a child, all we're doing is trying to please a parent, right? So transformation is absolutely necessary as you become an adult to recognize that you created patterns to get love from the person that raised you, and those patterns don't work as an adult. So we have to learn how to let go of them. Everyone has that. There's no way to get away from that.
It's pretty scary when you think about
Well, it makes you aware of what you're doing with your children, really, which is the thing that happens with me, which is why I mentioned earlier that usually when I'm working with someone, I work with everybody in the family. Because they recognize wherever they are at, that they're, mom and dad have adult children, they have children, it kind of flows down, right? If we can change, well, actually, if one person in the family changes, they can transform the whole family. But once you recognize the patterns, it's called the family system, by the way. Once you recognize the patterns that are in families, then, or in your family and in your life, then it's easier to understand how you became the person that you are, because we learn who we are, not by choice, because the way that we're raised, because we're so social, where our brain needs so much social care. I mean, it takes a long time before we start to talk, 2 years, right? So there's so many things that we're learning along the journey. So we're so impacted by those learned experiences that forms how we think. Those things are pretty much permanent. However, now I'm going to transition for a moment because I want to talk back to why someone comes into my world. That's because life is not working for them and they don't know why. Like, if you believe that you want something and you're trying to get it to happen and it's not happening, it's because your belief system isn't working. What you're doing isn't working. It's not that the world isn't honoring you. So what you're actually doing creates your world.
Interesting. So if things aren't going your way and the goals that you have, or just how you want life to be in terms of you feeling fulfilled, you're pushing it away, so to speak.
You actually are creating the world that you live in. The large percent of how life is going for you is how you react to the world. Now, you cannot change what's happening, but you create the world that you live in by how you respond to it.
It's so true. Yeah. And right?
Mm-hmm.
We all react to everything, no matter what it is. Something, well, you know what? we lost a internet connection before. We could have freaked out, went crazy over it. Like, what is going on? It's like, all right, no problem. We'll just move along. It'll be okay. But there's different ways to react to everything. And like you say, you can't control what's going on around you for the most part.
Right. And so the level to which you're able to move through that, or it's actually called participating with what's happening, as opposed to resisting it, which is so hard. Again, I want to go back to a principle that's powerful. When you are always resistant to what's happening, it means that you're wanting something that you can't have. Now, think about a 2-year-old. When a 2-year-old is stepping into 2, 3, and 4, the number one word that they learn is no.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the powerful things that we work on is teaching someone how to understand the power of no. Because if they didn't transition really well in that development of stage of life with the mom and dad, either they got everything that they wanted or they got nothing, then that actually affects how their brain functions as an adult. Because if everything went their way, they're extremely difficult to live with as an adult. But if nothing went their way, they're also difficult to live with as an adult, because either they always want things to go their way or things never go their way. And both of those transitions are difficult in the adult brain because they're going to operate differently, right? The person who always get what they want is going to be pretty demanding. Now, it kind of depends on the personality of the child, because the personality is innate, like color of eyes. And so there are some things that are really about how, some people are outgoing and some people are not, based on personality traits, but that's formed by those early years. And if a child doesn't learn how to negotiate no, in other words, sometimes things about them as a child and sometimes things are not about them as a child, if they don't learn that skill, then the brain always wants something that it didn't get.
And is that why a child goes on a tirade because they didn't get what they wanted?
Well, children are going to be different based on their personality traits. And so you really can't predict how an adult is going to be based on what you experience with a child. You can't. I mean, you can't say this 2-year-old is going to be a bad adult based on what they're doing, because we don't know how they're going to integrate that into their brain, because this is about integration. The only thing that we do know is that as an adult, if you're struggling, then the things that you integrated aren't working for you. So that's why we really can't predict, but you can always tell by who you are in the moment how well you experienced those things that were going on. Now, the difficulty here is saying, well, my mom and dad did a bad job. Well, irregardless of what mom and dad did, it doesn't really matter, because you're still responsible for who you are in the moment, right? So you can change anything about you regardless of what you experience. It doesn't matter, because the brain is so elastic. And that's really what we're talking about here, is understanding that no matter, that's why it doesn't matter what happened, because you can, for the most part, change just about everything that you learned, the patterns that were established while you're growing up. There's a few exceptions to that rule, and some of those are deal around abuse that can be pretty powerful. And also things that are learned between 0 and 2 are really hard to let go of, and you don't really see that a whole lot, but some very difficult things. Sometimes there's mental illness that's related to some of those early events. But for the most part, say the large number of people that I work, most everyone that I work with, well, actually, let me state this. The majority of individuals who are unhappy in life had a very difficult childhood. That's just how that is.
Yep. And it's almost hard to define happy in life. How do you ask that question? How do you answer that question? Are you happy in life?
Well, what do you think?
I think you are.
Do you think you're happy in life?
I think I am, but I'm a work in progress, and I know I am, and I'm working on myself because I know things I need to fix here and there. But I think my car is moving forward. Yeah.
So I have a question for you though, Steve. Why is happiness important?
Good question there, Dan. Fulfillment. You want to feel fulfilled, whatever it might be.
So happiness with you is fulfillment, right? But those are actually two different things.
Explain.
Well, fulfillment is a form of happiness, maybe, but it depends on how you want to define happiness, right? So you get to decide what happiness is for you. See, that's the fun part about this. There is no universal happiness. You define it, right? Well, fulfillment or contentment or having my family or having a good job or a nice car or where I live, there's all kinds of things that are happiness. So happiness is defined by what you want. The difficulty is that we have a tendency to define happiness based on what we learned. For example, right? Some families just are politically adverse to one idea or another. And so we're only happy if our political stand is in charge, right? So that has nothing to do with happiness. That has something to do with an experience that you don't want, right? So happiness is really about you, what you makes you happy. That's why yearnings are so important, because if you feel seen, if you feel heard, and you feel important or understood, then you're going to feel loved and cared for. To me, that's happiness. And that can happen in any form. Like you can be in crisis, like some of the things that are happening on the world stage right now. You can be in crisis and having to leave the country that you live in and still have joy and happiness, right? Because it's not about the circumstances, it's how you are approaching those circumstances internally.
What you're saying right here is just so powerful in terms of how people navigate their life. It's and back to your point, we can't do anything about the way we were raised. It is what it is, but it's how you react to it. Now, you said 0 to 2 is an important time, but is it 2 to 7 or is it 0 to 7 in terms of what really shaped you when you were a kid?
Well, without getting too complicated about it, it's 0 to 7 are the most important years of life. At 8 to 11, our brain is in a different kind of an interesting stage. For example, between 8 and 11, our brain is experiencing learning how to take what we learned earlier. Now, this is without our permission. 95% of all of our behavior is in our unconscious thinking. So in 8 to 11, our brain is taking what it experienced earlier and trying to form it into who we want to be. And in that respect, the experiences that you have between 8 and 11, that's a child who dreams about being a nurse or a doctor or an astronaut or flying an airplane or wanting to be in the service, kind of thing. That's those years, and the child is really developing the ability to dream. And that's a beautiful years, second grade to fourth grade kind of thing. It's a beautiful time of life for the brain. And then it changes 11 to 15. And the reason that those years are important is because, or 8 to 11, is because what the brain takes is those earlier experiences to tell us what life might be like. For example, back to the 0 to 2 or 0 to 4, harm that happens in those early years, because and another thing I keep taking these bunny trails, but a brain is formed around its experiences. And the earlier an experience, the more impact it has on how the brain is. In other words, your brain thinks or is formed according to the experiences. And how your brain thinks about the world is based on the experiences that you've had. And the earlier the experience, the more influence that experience has on your adult brain. Now, it isn't about what you know, because we don't really know 0 to 4 or 0 to 2. What we do know is that if we're really struggling with having close relationships and friendships, that means that the early on development didn't work really well. And so if something's happening in your life 0 to 4, it doesn't matter what happened. All we really need to focus on is what you really want life to be like. Because there's some things, and going through this process, we'll begin to understand how there's some things that are never going to change. And we have to come to terms with that, right? There's some things about us that are never going to change, but there's many things that can. But how you feel about things is the whole process here, because it gets back to the emotions of fear, hurt, anger, sad, and joy. How you experience or feel the current way life is going is all we're heading toward, because there's some things that you can't change. Let me give you an example. I worked with a family. There was a lot of them in the family, and all of them were kind of splintered a little bit, and none of them had close friendships from high school. And that's because you learn how to have friendships, lifelong friendships, by the time you're 4 or 5 years old, according to brain development. So you can look at your life about how it's going and see why you don't have those skills. Now, you can put those skills back in there, but if you don't have them, you can't use them. So that's why brain development is so important, but also it's important to understand that if there's something that you can't do that is natural, like to have lifelong friends, then it's a skill. And all we're doing is learning how to translate what we need into a skill base. So instead of trying to create friendships, we start out by letting go of the unpleasant things that we were experiencing, like being close or giving compliments or receiving compliments, things like that, or being childlike, we talked about before. When we can get into our childlike brain and kind of begin to recreate some of those things that we did when we were young, you can reform those early experiences. For example, again, what's fascinating is that if you become more childlike in your behavior. I'm not talking about foolish, but innocent in your behavior. That changes so much about you because we become like adults. We have to do things right. So we focus on, third or fourth week, depending on how far along they are, about how to become more childlike or innocent inside their thinking, like doing silly things. It creates all kinds of fascinating things on the inside of you when you release the idea that it's uncomfortable to, I don't know, to skip down the highway or to skip down the sidewalk rather, or, to, I don't know, just have fun, like just tell someone openly that how much you care about them, or do silly things like, I don't know, jump rope in the middle of the street, or jump rope at your work. One of the things, if you ever watch the movie Elf, he does a wonderful job of being childlike. And that childlike innocence creates this idea of being less judgmental, less condescending, more self-aware, looking at things as black and white instead of my experiences in the past. And so that's part of this process of learning how to be the person that you want to be.
I really want to translate that back with the acting like a child. To what degree? Because I feel like people say that about me. It's like I'm a big kid. And there's, depends on who you're with. Let's say you have a couple of friends and sometimes they kind of align with your, childlike side of you, so to speak. And then it kind of rolls from there. But so you're suggesting, and why are you suggesting it? I want to get clear on that. Why are we doing that?
Well, you got to get out of your adult brain. Okay. Now there's times to be an adult, right? But if you're so focused on doing the right thing and so focused on always already thinking and worrying, you're not in your innocent brain. You're not in your childlike brain. A child will see a yellow car and they're like, that's a yellow car. Because it's just true, right? Check that out. Right. And so when you're actually able to see the truth like that, you're lightweight. Like, for example, when I'm working with a particular couple and they're having some difficulties because he's always angry and she's always angry, I'm like, why are you responding that way? Like, he said these hurtful words to me. Like, I just hate the way you're treating me. Well, if you're a child, like, you'd be like, so I guess you don't like the way I'm treating you. Maybe something's happening inside me. I don't know. Maybe there's something about me that's not going on well, right? So I'll try to be better next time, right? If you can just be lightweight and own it, or, oh, you know what? We'll talk about that later. Learning how to not be so emotionally attached to what's happening is childlike. And that's freeing yourself up to be lightweight in what's happening and to respond not in a sarcastic way, but in a way that's actually not necessarily humorous, but about what's actually happening. Like, check that out. You're angry right now. That's funny to me. Why are you angry about that? That's silly to me, right? Or I love who you are. You're so fun to be with. Or another thing that a child will often do, right, is recognize what's just true. You're kind of grumpy, right?
It's so they'll call you out on it. That's what a kid would do.
Exactly. And in order for us to be in that lightweight place, we have to practice being childlike. And so again, gets back to practicing things that are uncomfortable, like playing, going to a park, swinging on a swing, singing silly songs, playing Chutes and Ladders, as you said earlier, or just being lightweight, right? Now, there's a time to be serious. We all know that that's true. But if you don't have the balance, then you're never really going to do super well because you're always in that adult, I got to be an adult brain. And the reason that happens, Steve, is because growing up, mom and dad are saying what to us?
Say it again.
Grow up.
Of course. or
they
empty the dishwasher.
Yeah, you have so many responsibilities. And so again, if we're always pleasing a parent, we're moving out of being childlike because we want to be like the parents. We want to make them happy.
Yep.
And so getting back to being childlike is more like innocence. And that gets back to the young brain. As a child, if mom and dad are always directing you and always telling you what to do, then as an adult, you don't want anyone to tell you what to do. It's kind of hurtful, right? So learning how to be childlike is when someone's bossing you around, how to be lightweight with it and how to respond in a way that really doesn't develop the difficulties in the relationship.
We're talking with coach Dan Clark, and you can check him out at transformlife.net. I want to look at one thing here that you just said. So when you're presented with some challenges, attack them or view them as a child so that it doesn't impact you the same exact way, right? What if you were to make yourself numb to them? So let's say these things come up. We have a problem here, problem here. Maybe you're somebody that always reacted to them. We got a problem. And maybe you've transformed your brain to say, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm kind of, the best way I can describe it is numb. Is that a bad thing?
Well, it is a bad thing in some respects, because let's go back to yearnings. The reason we react to something is because we don't feel seen. We don't feel heard. We don't feel important, right?
Right.
Right. And so if we can recognize that that's what's happening, that's childlike. Oh, man, I don't feel like you even are hearing me or seeing me right now. See, that's childlike. When we get to the yearnings, it removes the emotion from the power of the emotion. It removes back to just a behavior that we want. Like, you're not hearing me. Like, I don't feel important right now. And that actually, thinking about it from a yearning standpoint, creates the ability to be wise with what you really want. Like, if I'm not important in this relationship right now, then we're going to come back where I can feel important. That creates the ability to repair. And we haven't talked about this a lot, but all we're talking about really is learning how to repair harm that happens while we're growing up. Because if we don't learn how to repair, it's called reparation, repair most of our relationships in childhood, that means that life doesn't go well with us at all as an adult. Because when you are harmed and that repair never happens, you hold on to that harm. And so you naturally distance yourself, which is why, well, they don't see me. They don't hear me. I'm not important. So we act that way. And when we act that way, because I believe in self-fulfilling prophecy, how you behave is how people treat you. And so that's why we have to practice feeling seen. We practice someone like feeling important. Like, one of the things that we do is, if you are eating out and you have a meal that comes back not the way that you want it, to send it back, right? Most people are like, oh, we don't want to do that because that's so embarrassing. No, you send it back kindly, right? That's learning how to feel important. Or in a conversation with someone and they're always talking, you would just interrupt them and say, but it's my turn. Learning how to be uncomfortable by stating what you're experiencing from a yearning aspect.
I have a friend that won't send a meal back because she's afraid of something that will take place back in the kitchen when they bring the meal back to you.
Oh, yeah.
But what is that? You're worrying about something that's probably not going to take place anyway, but it's stuck in her brain instead of being heard.
So if you think about that, Steve, let's think about her, for example, of what she actually is doing.
She's suppressing her desires or her yearning to be heard by the server and be served a meal that she expected.
She's living her limited life, not her best life, because some outside circumstance that she can't even prove is controlling her. She doesn't trust the unknown. Oh, well,
yeah.
We can't, we always have to be suspicious about things. Now, there's obviously we want to be aware of, but it's more like, oh, if I don't want to send it back, I'm okay with that. And if I do, I'm okay with that too, but I trust that, right? But here's the important part of this. I just mentioned to you self-fulfilling prophecy. What that means is that when she feels that way, behind her back or in her world, she'll be treated that way. Now, think about a circle, and it has all the different things that you have inside you as far as energy: judgment, love, unkindness, unforgiveness, bitterness, anger, hatred, unsettledness, unkindness. The energy that's inside you is what you attract. So when you become innocent, when you start moving toward being childlike, you move away from judgment, unforgiveness. You move more toward kindness and truth. And when you have better childlike energy inside you, you attract that same type of energy. People will treat you according to the energy inside you.
That's extremely powerful. And acting like a child, who doesn't love a child?
It's innocent, right?
It's innocent. Yeah.
Now, I'm convinced that you can solve almost all conflict in 10 minutes or less.
I would subscribe to that if you have the right mindset.
Right. Because all you want to do is be heard, right? Well, why? The core is that there's a misunderstanding, and how can you repair the relationship? Right. What do you want to repair the relationship? There isn't even a middle ground here. How do you want to feel? What's the yearning that you want in this relationship? That's all you need to get to. What's the yearning? I want to feel feel heard and understood. Powerful men and women who are negotiators understand that. That it's not about what you actually are wanting, It's about what that person is experiencing with you, right?
I read something recently. Maybe you've heard the same exact thing. And life is a negotiation. You could be talking to your kids. We're going to negotiate about getting the chores done. If speaking to somebody, whatever it might be. And they did research on this, and the research is just be quiet. It's not being disrespectful. You may think it is. Just be quiet. It's a 3-second rule. Ease back. Let the other person think that you're thinking about their viewpoint. They will feel heard and understood. And all you did was do nothing. That's all you had to do.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that's a principle that I hadn't heard that about that research, but I call it the shut up rule, which means that you just stop talking. Silence is your friend. It's beautiful because when you're silent, what are they doing?
They're either silent or thinking.
Yeah, they're probably right. And sometimes if you're silent, they're leaning towards you because when you're silent, if there's actually silence, here's a principle. The last thing that you say is the only thing someone remembers.
Yes.
So that's why, these 3-hour conversations, whatever, are worthless. So just say it and just repeat it. I just didn't like this. It didn't feel good to me. Wasn't something I really wanted. I wanted something different. I don't know where the middle ground is, but until I feel like I'm different, this feels different to me, I'm not going to go anywhere with you, right?
And the other thing is too, people will remember not exactly what you said, how you made them feel by what you said.
Yeah.
People forget that all the time. It's how you said it. That's the impression that's going to be made in somebody. So when you work with somebody, Dan, do you take them through a lot of these principles, depending on their situation and what their goals are? How does it work with you?
Well, what they show up with, what's happening in their world is very important. So we need to start really right there about what they want. But we start out with actually clarity. Like, what do they really want? What do they really feel like they want out of life? Because this is just a circumstance that they can't solve, but that's because this bigger picture, their belief system doesn't work. So we start out with what do they want life to be like in 5 years? Because we live in 5-year cycles, 2-year, and 5-year cycles. So we start out by, after we kind of solve some of the current things, they want to be heard. Then we find out what they want 5 years from now. And we start focusing on how that view can be integrated into what the difficulty is right now. And from that, we move toward becoming their best self. Because as they let go of the belief system that they have on the inside of them and the old attitudes that show up in their life, as they begin to let go of those, the other problems just naturally go away. I mean, what's magical is that you don't really have to figure out how to behave with their partner or with the boss that they're with, or even a coworker. All they need to learn is how to monitor what's happening inside them and how to respond in a way that makes the relationship lean toward them. If they change who they are, everything changes. So you move toward what do they want and how can they become that person?
Have you found, working with people, what they thought they wanted wasn't really what they wanted?
All the time. Yeah, I work with a guy who is a fantastic salesman, making a lot of money. And so many things in this world are just falling apart. And we've been working together for a while. And he's like, I don't think I should have ever had this job. No wonder I'm not happy. And as he's rethinking it, it's like he was always doing what he felt he was supposed to do, right? Didn't really know himself. And it's fascinating to watch him transform into and translate those old ways of thinking into who he really wants to be. Because now he's recognizing how to satisfy his own yearnings. Has a daughter, and it's just so powerful how he's changing and how he's even handling her and being more lightweight with her. Like he was watching her skate on some ice a little while back, and he's not able to do that. But he was like, I enjoyed that more than I ever would have in the past because I was just enjoying being with her.
Yep, he was present.
He was,
yeah.
Because he let expectations. I got to make sure that she has this and she has that. No, it's just time frame. And it's again understanding that when he's with himself, he's with them too.
Yeah, it's amazing how you bring things out, Dan. It really is. And it's great that you make us all think about our lives, our path. I mean, from the beginning to now, and then also, not a bad thing, question our existence, why are we here, what our yearnings are. And I agree with you that I think that a lot of us, if we were to think of what we thought we wanted, it's probably not really what we wanted.
Yep. Again, we're always pleasing a parent that raised us. So often we get into an idea that we're doing something to make someone else happy. And that's why we get sidetracked.
I heard a term a while ago, and you just brought it back into my brain. Reparent yourself.
Mhm.
Reparent yourself. You are your
Well,
parent, so to speak.
yeah, well, I hear that all the time, which is I actually, what I get to do for a living is I actually am reparenting someone. You're taking them back to the things that they didn't learn while they were a child. Even you were, and so but their willingness to trust that is fascinating because there has to be a trust in that. And in that, because they're seeing changes, which is why I mentioned earlier that usually when I work with a family member, I work with everybody in the family, as they begin to see that transition happen, and this person is becoming so much kinder and gentler, everybody wants to get on board with that. It's just transformational to everyone.
Yeah. And it's exciting because you have a future. You have a future, but you can make your future better just by having the right skills. And again, we've talked before, if you have kids, if your parents weren't taught, then they didn't transfer that onto you in terms of giving you the skills to deal with life. What are you going to do? You're not going to pass it on to your kids because you didn't know. I don't know how to do that.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
only know what you don't know what you don't know.
Guilty as charged. Without a doubt.
Exactly.
We have a couple of minutes left. Tell everybody if they want to reach out to you and how the process works to work with Life Coach Stan Clark.
Well, working with me is it's not hard, but it is kind of hard. We often laugh about this idea. By the way, the website is transformlife.net. You'll find a way to get a hold of me right there. Always some new things happening on that. So just please get a hold of me. I'd love to see you there. I also do a 2-minute podcast every day. If you want to get that text or that podcast, it's right there. When someone starts working with me, the difficulty is learning how to be okay with being uncomfortable. And that's the most difficult part of this. So part of the process is recognizing that I want to feel good all the time. That's not possible. Our willingness to be uncomfortable in this process creates the comfortable feeling that you want later. And by the way, life is about feeling uncomfortable and learning how to manage that.
When you think about it, it is, because we always take the path of least resistance to feel comfortable, but that doesn't mean that's the right path to take.
Correct. Absolutely. Yep.
As always, Dan, great talking with you. And, we said an hour this time. I don't even know where the time went. Just flew by. And a lot of great principles and reinforcing what we've said before about how your childhood really does dictate your future.
Yeah.
And you get right to the point that it's all about emotions. I don't know any other life coach that's ever said that.
You asked some great questions, Steve, and it's been good working with you. And it is so powerful to recognize that we don't have to be the person that we are.
Yeah. But you need to realize that. And sometimes it takes somebody like you to point that out. We
can't do it alone.
You know what it is? We all know we should be doing something else. I firmly believe that, but until somebody points it out, you're not going to really get it. You need to talk to somebody. And so reach out. Transformlife.net. And Dan, as always, great talking with you, and look forward to catching up again sometime soon.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. And we'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you can now listen live on the MyTuner Radio and online Radio Box apps for iOS, Android, and the Amazon App Store. Or check us out online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com or search Podcast Business News Network on onlineradiobox.com/US so you don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned. This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.